Director of Public Programs here, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's Hammer Forum on the recent flurry of abortion laws implemented in states like Ohio, Missouri, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Utah. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and our guest speakers today are California State Senator Connie Leyva, Loyola Law School Professor Brietta Clark, NARAL Pro-Choice America's Amy Everitt, and our moderator today is Shaniqua McClendon, Political Director of Crooked Media. Before we get started, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and please note that taking photographs and video and audio recording are not permitted in the theater. We are videotaping this program, though, and it'll be made available on the Hammer website if you would like to share it with your friends and family at any time. I also want to mention a few upcoming Hammer programs you might be interested in. The next Hammer Forum will be on Tuesday, September 19th, and we'll have 4 constitutional scholars here to discuss the upcoming cases headed to the Supreme Court, which will begin hearing cases in October. Then on October 22nd, we'll have a Hammer Forum to discuss the latest news on impeachment proceedings. And then on November 12th, we have a special Hammer Forum discussion about what reparations for slavery would look like in the United States. We're also bringing back our very popular Constitution Happy Hour this fall. It'll be Friday evenings readings and discussions about the U.S. Constitution led by leading Constitution scholars. It's kind of like a book club, but with cocktails and free copies of the Constitution. We also have a talk with Oliver Sacks biographer Lawrence Weschler, and a talk about the importance of libraries with Susan Orlean and Roxane Gay. So we have a really great lineup of free public programs coming up this fall. Make sure that you get on the Hammer mailing list so that you can get reminders about those programs. Now, on to today's program. I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers, and then we'll get started. Amy Everitt is the Vice President for Special Projects at NARAL Pro-Choice America, where she oversees NARAL's initiative to engage corporations and business leaders to support reproductive freedom. In her former position as the State Director for NARAL Pro-Choice California, Everitt has been an advocate for reproductive freedom for women and families throughout California. Under her leadership, California has been a beacon for proactive, pro-choice public policy, including regulating fake women's health centers, expanding abortion access, and ensuring pharmacies dispense birth control, emergency contraception, and medical abortion pills. Amy's background in elections, campaigns, and grassroots organizing have helped position NARAL as one of the top advocacy organizations for reproductive freedom in the state. Everitt also serves on the board for the Center for Civic Engagement, and she's a committee member of the Civil Rights Coalition of California. Loyola Law School Professor Brietta Clark is an expert on healthcare law and inequality. Her research focuses on the biases and structural defects that create inequity in our healthcare delivery and financing systems, and the role that law and government regulators play in ensuring equitable access to healthcare. She has special expertise in the impact of Obamacare on Medicaid and private insurance access, reproductive and sexual health barriers, mental health care, and hospital closings in low-income neighborhoods. Clark is also on the faculty of the Bioethics Institute at Loyola Marymount University and provides active service to numerous legal, medical, and consumer-based organizations and providers. California State Senator Connie Leyva is serving her second term in the California State Senate, representing District 20, which includes the cities and communities of Bloomington, Chino, Colton, Fontana, Grand Terrace, Montclair, Muscoy, Ontario, Pomona, Rialto, and San Bernardino. As our state senator, she's committed to improving California's schools, environment, and communities, as well as creating quality jobs throughout the 20th State Senate District and the whole state of California. During her first term in office, Senator Leyva authored important legislation signed into law, including SB 813 to eliminate the statute of limitation on rape, SB 597 to protect human trafficking victims, SB 1015 to permanently extend overtime for domestic workers, SB 820 to ban secret settlements in sexual harassment, assault, and discrimination cases, and most relevant to today's conversation, SB 24 to allow access to abortion for students at the University of California. Senator Leyva serves as chair of the Senate Education Committee, California Legislative's Women's Caucus, and the state's Democratic Caucus, as well as on the Budget and Fiscal Review, Business, Professions, and Economic Development, Elections, and Constitutional Amendments, and Health Committees, and Budget Subcommittee on Education. She also currently serves on the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls and the State Senate Select Committees on California-Mexico Cooperation and Women and Inequality. Our moderator today is Shaniqua McClendon. McClendon is the political director for Crooked Media, home to the popular podcast Pod Save America. At Crooked Media, McClendon led the creation of their midterm voter engagement program called Vote Save America. She's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she earned her master's in public policy. During her studies, she also worked at Facebook on their politics and government outreach team. Prior to graduate school, McClendon served in various capacities on Capitol Hill, starting off as an intern in the Obama administration, and then she was a staff assistant for Senator Kay Ivey and went on to serve as legislative director for Congresswoman Alma S. Adams. So please join me in welcoming Senator Connie Leyva, Professor Brietta Clark, Amy Everitt, and our moderator, Shaniqua McClendon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I think we're going to have a great conversation. We have some really great women up here to chat. And just before we get started, I'm going to start before I start asking you any questions. And today we're going to be chatting about reproductive rights, and a lot of, Claudia mentioned this, a lot of what we've seen in the state legislatures and, what many people would characterize as attacks on reproductive rights, but those didn't start yesterday or this year or within the past year. Excuse me, sorry. Abortion has long been, a contentious issue in our, or at least it's been portrayed to us as a contentious issue in our country. During passage of the Affordable Care Act, some Democrats' support even came down to what would be in the bill as far as abortion, and the Hyde Amendment kind of was heightened at that point as to whether federal funding could be used for abortion. And even since then, we've seen at the federal level attempts to pass 20-week abortion bans and attempts to restrict federal funding from abortion providers, even if the federal funds, they can't use federal funds on abortion services, but for other services such as family planning and STD examinations. And within the past year, we've seen even more come from the state level. And so we're going to have a conversation today about what's going on at the state level, why we should pay more attention to what's going on at the state level and not only the federal level, and just have a conversation about what's at stake and what we possibly can expect moving forward in this conversation. So I'm just going to start off by asking each of our panelists one question to kind of get us up to date or up to speed on everything that's going on, and then we'll dive into a few more general topics, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions. So thank you again. And if we could just give our panelists one more round of applause. Okay, Amy, I just kind of went through really broadly a lot of the things that have happened, I guess even, since I've been alive, but there's been stuff obviously going on before that. Could you walk everyone through what is going on at the state level and what some of these bills look like, what they would do, and where some of them stand right now?
Sure, and thank you for that question, and thank you for that introduction. So good afternoon, everybody. The rollbacks and the media are really focusing on the states that are trying to take away women's reproductive rights. What I want to touch upon really quickly is the fact that there are also states that are working really hard to expand access to abortion care and birth control, and that none of this came out of the blue. As you mentioned, the second Roe v. Wade was passed, the efforts to undo it started. 2010 was a pivotal year for the anti-choice movement. It was an election cycle where most state legislatures switched hands. We had always had at least one house where we could stop bad legislation from going through. We either had the governor's house, the governor's mansion, a state house, or a state senate. In 2010, we lost 35 states. And that's when we really started to see this anti-choice legislation that we had been hearing about for a long time actually get passed. It had been introduced and failed, and now it was passing. What these include: we saw a lot of trap laws. Those are targeted regulations of abortion providers, so really going after abortion providers. And they included ridiculous things like how high the grass out in front of your clinic could be. It included very specific things about being an ambulatory medical center, which means you have to be able to perform open heart surgery in your clinic. One thing you should know: abortion is one of the safest and most common medical procedures in America today. It is not open heart surgery. But you had to maintain both all the operating lights and all the medicines that nobody ever used to do it. It became prohibitively expensive. That was one type of one. Another was admitting privileges to a hospital. Again, abortion is the safest medical procedure in America. Not a lot of people were going to emergency rooms. And I don't know about you all, but when I go to an emergency room, my doctor doesn't go with me. So having them have admitting privileges was just one more obstacle. There were other laws that were being passed around waiting periods. South Dakota passed the most onerous one, which was 72 hours. You'd have to wait 72 hours from the time you met with your doctor to the time you could access the care. And then they went back and they realized that they had to redefine it and say that only counted Monday through Friday, because women apparently don't think on weekends and holidays. But if you think about the fact that there's only one clinic in South Dakota that is open for 1 week a month, this becomes a very onerous process. So those are some of the things. And then, as you mentioned, the bans, funding bans, religious, I think you'll probably speak more about this, but giving doctors and anybody the ability to not fill prescriptions, to not provide services, to not refer women to the care that they are seeking. Those are the types of legislation that we saw. And we saw, like last month, right, we saw Georgia, Alabama, Missouri within the same week ban abortion. We can call it whatever we want, but if you're passing a bill that outlaws abortion at 6 weeks, it's an abortion ban, because most women don't know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. But they really caught the imagination and the horror of most Americans. And we stood up, and there was a lot of outcry and a lot of attention. But the reality is that there are about 25 states that have abortion bans on their books already. Ohio alone bans abortion every time they come into session. First it was 20 weeks, then it was 12 weeks, now it's 6 weeks. For gender selection, for any reason they can come up with, they're trying to ban abortion. But at the end of the day, what these are all about is about controlling women, taking away our freedoms to have the lives that we want to lead, and pregnant people. And that is a lot of what is happening right now. But I want to also just say that as the landscape, like 340, I think, anti-choice bills were introduced last year, about 200 were actually passed. But at the same time, we have been winning in pro-choice states, and we have been expanding access to coverage. Senator Leyva will talk about that. But Virginia, New York, Chicago, Illinois, these are all states that are strengthening their laws, because there is a fundamental belief that it is not if Roe falls, it is when. And when Roe falls, states that are able to provide access are going to need to step up their game and protect their citizens and those who are coming into their states.
Thank you. Bree, we have, Amy just mentioned Alabama, Missouri, and Georgia all kind of in a short amount of time taking efforts to ban abortion, and there's no way that the lawmakers don't know that there will be, a group like NARAL coming along to challenge the constitutionality of these laws, but they continue to pass them. I guess the question here is, why would they do that? And is there some larger scheme scheme is a strong word, but is there a larger effort at play that they're trying to kind of prepare for?
So yes, definitely. They want to overturn Roe versus Wade. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page about what the law is and what it allows. So these bans, as Shaniqua said, are clearly unconstitutional, because the fundamental right that was established in Roe v. Wade had as one of those principles, you cannot ban abortion before viability. That has been affirmed by the Supreme Court in subsequent cases. So the point of these laws is to try to get a law that will go up to the Supreme Court with the belief, the hope that enough justices on the Supreme Court will take that opportunity to overturn Roe versus Wade. So people are paying attention to these, and in particular, people are paying attention to the arguments that are being used to assert the need for the ban. As a way to try to understand what might justices do, which arguments might they pick up on, if any of these, or might they do something different. One of the interesting things that you see in kind of the arguments kind of supporting these bans are things that do reflect a larger, and I will use the word scheme in the sense that there is a broader coordinated effort beyond even the bans. And so these things are connected, and so it's important to understand that. So for example, you may have heard of these heartbeat bills, 6-week bans. So part of what they're doing, opponents of abortion access, are pushing back on that viability framework that was announced in Roe that said you can't ban before viability. So they want to identify cardiac activity as a new point at which we should be able to ban to protect fetal life. Before that, there were bans at about 18, 20 weeks that we were seeing in states. The justification for those was the claim that the fetus could feel pain at that time, even though science says that the fetus has not developed the capacity, what they would need to be able to feel pain. And yet that argument was asserted to try to justify those bans pre-viability. Courts have been rejecting those as well. But what we see is this pushing the boundaries of science. And so one of the latest arguments as well that's been made is, well, medical technology is advancing so quickly that soon we will be able to help a fetus become viable much earlier than we ever imagined or that people could have predicted at the time of Roe. And so what you see courts who are actually engaging these arguments, they're saying enough with the potential what could be and enough with wrong science. We need to deal with reality. We need to deal with what's going on now when we apply the viability framework. So that's what's happening now because the courts feel so constrained and the viability framework is pretty clear cut. But Amy described a whole bunch of other kinds of laws that are short of a ban. And these are laws specifically targeting abortion providers and sometimes the patients through the provider-patient relationship. You may have heard of these called TRAP laws, targeted regulation of abortion providers. At the time Roe v. Wade was kind of identified the fundamental right, the court tried to make clear that states should not be able to target abortion for special regulations that other healthcare procedures don't get or don't have to comply with. Treat it like any other healthcare issue, right? The challenge has been, though, after 1992, when there was a shift in the court, there was a weakening of this protection. So you may have heard Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This is the 1992 case that officially affirmed the fundamental right identified in Roe. But it basically opened the door for states to be able to start targeting abortion and treating it differently from other kinds of healthcare procedures. So providers have to comply with burdensome regulations. They have to do more to prove their qualifications than providers using or engaging in procedures that are either comparable risk or even riskier. They make patients have to, or they can make patients have to listen to certain counseling designed to discourage abortion. They can force an unnecessary medical ultrasound, so the patient has to go through that before she can get an abortion. So these are all things that would not be allowed for any other kind of procedure or in any other context. But the 1992 decision opened the door for that. And some of those have been problematic, but courts generally are not striking those down because the test for that is a mushier one that I can go into more detail if people want. It's just not as clear-cut as the ban. Where we're really getting into trouble are these restrictions that are making it almost impossible for providers to comply, because practically that is almost like a ban in the sense that it is causing clinics to close. And we have states that have one clinic, and we almost had our first state with no abortion clinics because of these kinds of restrictions. And just I'll say a quick note about the admitting privileges requirement, for example. one of the reasons that is so burdensome and in some places impossible for providers to comply with is because the hospitals in that state will not give admitting privileges to a provider who provides abortion. It is about the hostility within that state to abortion. It's not about the provider's qualifications. So nothing about that law is actually advancing or promoting health.
And thinking about the role that the courts are playing in women's access to reproductive rights and specifically the fear that Roe v. Wade will be overturned, and thinking through, a lot of states are passing these trigger laws where if it is overturned, it will immediately make abortion inaccessible to women in that state. But on the other side of that, as Amy mentioned, there are efforts in more progressive states to protect abortion in the event that Roe v. Wade is overturned. And Connie, you are part of that group of legislators who's working on that. You introduced SB 4, the College Student Right to Access Act. Could you tell us a little bit more about your bill, but also talk to us about the importance of taking these efforts through the state legislature and not leaving it up to the federal government and the Supreme Court to make these decisions?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here today. So aren't we lucky we live in California? Thank God we live in California. And I have the luckiest job of all, because as a legislator, I get to see that there's a problem or an issue, and we get to introduce legislation, try to get it at the governor's desk, and try to get it signed into law. So SB 24 is our second attempt at making sure all public universities provide medicated abortion on campus. We had SB 320 the last 2 years. It got to the governor's desk last year, and he vetoed it, saying that he did not think it was unreasonable for women to travel off campus 5 to 7 miles to find an abortion provider. My comment to that was, another old white guy telling me what to do with my body. Woo-woo. So we reintroduced the bill this year. It was the first bill that Team Leyva reintroduced. And this bill is about access. This bill is about making sure that students have access to their constitutional right to have an abortion. And it would require this to happen on all public universities, as I said. And I think what's really interesting and what we found through lots of hearings and lots of testimony and whatnot is people are so afraid to give women the right to access abortion, and they don't want to talk about it. And for me personally, I'm so tired of women being shamed. And if a woman has an abortion, somehow she has done something wrong. You don't know her life. You have not walked in her shoes. Medicated abortion is as safe as Tylenol. It is as safe as Viagra, but you can be sitting at home watching TV and you can call and you can order Viagra over the phone. So we want to make sure men can do whatever they want with their bodies, but we're not allowing women to do what they want with their bodies. So we'll see. If the governor doesn't sign this, maybe we'll do something in California to regulate men's bodies. I don't know. I'm just kidding. But it's so important that in states where we are more progressive, where we do value women, it's so important that we try and push through this legislation, because my hope always is that we can be a role model and we can set an example and it will spread across the country. And as I've said for the last 3 years, there will be a time when medication abortion is available on campuses, and then a few years down the road, people will say, oh, there was a time when this didn't happen. It will be our new normal. Sometimes it's just a little bit harder getting to that new normal, but we have to keep doing everything we can, because this is, as was stated before, this is a control issue. This is about women not being able to control their life and control their bodies. So I'm excited to get to do my job.
Yeah, that is great. Gosh, now I feel like all of the last 2 years have blurred together. Brett Kavanaugh got confirmed last year, right? Yes. Okay. So
It's okay. It's just all bad.
yeah. During his confirmation, obviously there was the sexual assault accusation against him, but a huge part of the conversation was, if he's confirmed, this is what's going to put Roe v. Wade at risk. And a larger conversation came out of that about what's at stake and, what can we do to fight this? And again, that's why I think talking about state legislatures is so important, because, Mitch McConnell is Mitch McConnell, and he's in charge right now, and we can't do anything about that until 2020. But as that conversation has been happening, there's been a lot of conversations under the surface, and I know none of you work at Planned Parenthood, but I did have just a couple of questions about Planned Parenthood as it relates to the larger conversation. The first is around Dr. Nguyen's resignation. From what I understood about that, there was a bit of a rift with her focus on more comprehensive healthcare and making Planned Parenthood more of a women's healthcare organization and not a pro-abortion one. What should our conversation be around abortion now? How should we talk about it? Should we be saying pro-choice or pro-abortion? Like, how can people be advocates, and like what tools do they need and language do they need to do that?
That is a really important conversation to be having, because the language of the last 40 years is stale and old and not really all that effective anymore. You can run into people who call themselves pro-choice and they're not really, and you can run into people who are pro-life who are actually pro-choice. It gets very complicated when you put labels on it. I think the most important way to be talking about this issue today, well, the first thing I want everybody in this room to know is that the people who support legal access to abortion are the super majority in this country. This is not the most controversial issue that we have today. 7 in 10 Americans support the right to choose. Now, that is true in Georgia as in California. It doesn't matter about the political party or their religious affiliation or their socioeconomic status. Poll after poll over the last few years has demonstrated 7 in 10 support access. Now, do all 7 in 10 sit there and say abortion on demand without apology? No. A lot of folks will say, and this is, I think, real growth in our movement, they'll say, I personally would not access abortion care, but that is not my decision for everybody else. And so there is this recognition that it is time to let other people make the right decision for themselves and their families, because as Connie said, only they know what it's like to walk in their shoes. Only they know what the circumstances are in their lives, about who they are with, about whether they can be a good parent or are ready to be a good parent, about what is at stake if they have children or if they don't. So I think that is a really important piece of it. And the other side of it, in terms of language in general, is that let's be clear that abortion is a medical term. It is a medical procedure. It's not a movement. I don't go fight for medical procedures. What I'm fighting for is the dignity and respect of all women and pregnant people in our country. And I think that is what the real inflection point is right now. It is about, do we think that women and people can become pregnant? Can they make the right decisions for themselves and their family? Most Americans agree with it. A small minority of elected officials don't. And we are coming to that reckoning point. I think that when people are making these decisions, they are not thinking, oh, but I voted pro-choice or I voted pro-life. They're thinking, am I ready to be a parent? Yeah. And it's an economic issue, and it is a private issue. It's a personal decision that only they can make for themselves. And I think we need to remember that government politicians cannot make good decisions. They kind of make crappy doctors.
So as a law professor, well, we're really wordy. We write long law review articles. We're not known for being really catchy, savvy kind of folks, right, in the world out there. So I defer. I think that is a really hard question and an important conversation. I will say in my writing, I struggled with this. And so one of the things I realized is that, the idea of pro-abortion, right? Again, when you really boil down to abortion as a procedure and what it means, actually people have viscerally uneasy kind of feelings and reactions to the idea of abortion itself versus asking, well, who should be able to make that hard decision versus, and once somebody is able to, should they be able to access it, right? Those are each different kinds of pieces, right? So one of the things I do is focus, at least in terms of the legal conversations I have, about who supports abortion access and who is trying to restrict abortion access. And a lot of that comes from my healthcare access kind of orientation to the conversation as well. The other thing about choice that's tricky, so it's been used in a bad way by courts. So choice has been used to kind of wall off the sphere of what an individual is entitled to do in the privacy of his or her own home, and the government shouldn't interfere with that. In healthcare, what that means is the government's been able to disclaim its obligation or any affirmative obligation it should have to help make sure people have essential goods like healthcare, like housing, like food, shelter, these kinds of things. And so what that has meant is that in the courts, the Supreme Court has said, yeah, the government can't ban abortion at a particular time, but it's okay for the government to say you can't use the funds you'd normally be able to get in Medicaid for that abortion because we don't have to subsidize it. That's your choice. You can't force the government to subsidize. And I think it's a perversion of the word choice. So I actually don't think that's the right meaning of it, but it's why I get nervous when I hear it, because I immediately think back to those opinions where it seems like it's a separation and government kind of shirking its own responsibility and not being honest about the fact that when they create benefit programs that people are entitled to as a legal matter, like Medicaid, or now like subsidies to private insurance on the exchange, that when the government tries to tell you, but you can't use it for this particular procedure, it is actually punishing you for a choice that you're making. That should actually be seen as an unconstitutional condition on those funds, but unfortunately the courts don't see it that way.
Connie, kind of in the same vein, when we were backstage, you were just talking about how people need to talk to each other more. And you, as a state senator, you talk to a lot of your constituents. I imagine some of them are, pretty aligned with you, not all of them. So what are those conversations like, and how can we use more conversations to move people to a more, at least understanding space, but just thinking that women and people who can have babies should be able to make these decisions themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I would first say how much we all love Planned Parenthood, and 97% of what they do is provide health care for women and men. 3% of what they do is provide abortions, and I think that people really forget that. So we do coffees on Team Leyva, and it's my favorite thing to do because we, go to a little coffee house or a little restaurant, and the public comes in. There's usually 30 to 50 people, and we always have conversations about, usually it's about legislation that I'm carrying. So the last 3 years, a lot of it has centered around abortion. And I don't want to get emotional, but I'm so proud of the women because, as I said before, we shame women. And if, I've heard everything carrying this legislation. And, one of the women standing out in front of one of our copies was telling my district director that he was going to go to hell because he worked for me. And, that's why women don't always stand up for other women, is because people are mean to you if you think women should be able to access abortion and abortion care, abortion services. So women stand up and they talk about why they had an abortion. And one that stood out to me most recently was a woman who said, and she started to cry, and she said, I couldn't afford the third child. And she said it was an accident. Because the other thing that people always say, men, all the men who follow me and hate me for being pro-choice, she said, I couldn't afford this child. I was on birth control and it failed. Every woman that we have talked to who has come through our doors, who's testified in committee, was on some sort of form of birth control. And, people would say, oh, why can't she do this? Why can't she do that? Well, we forget that there are two people it takes to make a baby. And why can't the man be a part of it? Why can't he make sure that she is able to access abortion care? So, but listening to people, and this woman spoke, and another woman spoke about being on campus and being so young and just thinking, I don't know how to take care of a child. So really just listening to people, talking to them, as you said, Amy, about people just, they think they're pro-choice or they think they're pro-life. And then you get into the conversation and they might be different from what they think. But I also think when we go back to what we're supposed to say, it is a choice. I'm not asking anyone to have an abortion. I am saying that women who find themselves in that situation should make that decision for themselves and their family. So I think talking pro-choice is important, but I also feel like we have to use the word abortion to take away the stigma. And we have made a very conscious effort on Team Leyva when we talk about this bill that it is, and there's no pro-abortion industry. There's no abortion industry that I've ever aware of anyway, but it's okay to say the word. And I think that women, as I said earlier, we just continue to shame women for something that is their constitutional right and they should have access to and not be shamed because they made that decision. We don't know why. Right. It's their choice.
Yeah. And you mentioned women being shamed, and Amy, you talked about, now I'm conflating conversations. I think we were talking about this backstage, but us not centering women enough, and we're not hearing the stories of the people who have to make these decisions. We're hearing about these, I guess, magical fetuses that exist on their own, and then are people. What shift needs to happen, and how can the conversation go from where it is now to actually focusing on the hard decision that has to be made with the person who has to make it?
Can we just let women make their own decision? I mean, why do we have to get into this with everyone? I mean, honestly, it's shocking that in 2019 we're having these conversations, but because it is a very strategic thing that is being used by the right wing and the Christian right, we don't need to be talking about this, quite honestly. It's a woman's constitutional right to have an abortion. Why are we still fighting this fight? I mean, I know why, and we'll continue. I'll do my part. But it really is shocking. We shouldn't even be talking about this, because if I want to have an abortion, it's my choice, and I don't need to ask anyone's permission.
You didn't call Mike Pence?
Lord, no.
I think there's some facts that people should know about abortion. One is that 6 in 10 women who access abortion care are already moms. So think about that. They are making parenting decisions about what they can do best for their children, and we have politicians telling them that they should make decisions that would make them worse parents. Is that really what we mean about a pro-family environment or family values? The other statistic is that 1 in 4 women in America will have an abortion before they are 45. So look around. We are in this room. You all know somebody. And to your point, if you know a woman who has had an abortion, then you know a man who has been responsible for the situation causing the abortion decision. So I think we really need to make sure, the way we center this conversation is, to your point, it ain't our decision. It isn't our business. It is the business of the people making the decision. What we have to work on, and the reason we have to be political about it, is that the other side has made it a political football. They have chosen to politicize a medical procedure. And our job now in 2020 is to fight back against that. I mean, it has been for a long time, but this is really the moment where we can stand up and say, no, we're gonna make our own decisions and get out of our way. You are out of step with where America is, and we need to hold them accountable. We have a program in Georgia called Reclaim Georgia, and we have identified the 16 state house seats that it will take to change that chamber, because if you don't like the policies, change the policy makers. We love our policy makers here. But in Georgia, we don't. And so we're investing, and we know it's gonna take 2 or 3 election cycles, but we're gonna claw back every single one of those seats, because those people are out of step with America, they're out of step with Georgia, and you do not ban abortion and not pay a price for it.
So kind of given how the fact that abortion is uniquely a procedure undergone by women, and that the restrictions that we've already talked about are treating women differently, treating them as if they can't and don't have the capacity to make decisions the way they would for any other medical procedure, or the rest of the country is allowed to make decisions for medical procedure. One might think, well, why hasn't somebody just brought a gender discrimination? Like, how could this occur? Why isn't this an obvious equal protection claim or gender discrimination claim? That was tried a while ago. The Supreme Court has refused to kind of acknowledge that healthcare regulations, like regulations targeting procedures unique to women, should be considered sex-based classifications that should get scrutinized closely. They're very deferential to them, to the state, whatever the interest is. So that's a problem. People are trying again with some of the more recent challenges. We're seeing it being brought up again in opinions. We'll see if it goes anywhere. But women have gotten erased literally from the law governing this area, despite how it impacts women, and despite the fact that if you look at the documents from organizations that are pushing for anti-abortion restrictions, that they actually use language that is gender stereotyping and talks about women's natural roles as mothers and how abortion violates that and therefore must harm women. And women couldn't possibly be making these decisions with a sound mind, because a mom could never do that to her child. I mean, this is the kind of language that's used in documents by these organizations. And yet courts have kind of erased gender considerations. I'll just say one more thing to bring it back to Planned Parenthood, is that in terms of the conversation, looking more broadly at this and thinking about, so what is actually truly going to support life or support a woman's most informed ability to choose childbirth and to choose to have a child versus an abortion? We should talk to them. Actually, we know. And a huge part of that is kind of what supports, like what kind of financial supports they have, what other employment supports they have, what other kind of childcare supports they have. If you look at the states that are most hostile to abortion, those are the states doing the least to support pregnant women. And they're doing the least to provide health care to poor people who this impacts. The states that have kind of the most open, supportive choice policies, like California, actually does the most to try to help pregnant women, and especially poor pregnant women, at the moment they're pregnant, to try to get them the resources they need. Is California perfect? No. Like, we got work to do. But to me, that helps tell the story, and Planned Parenthood is a huge part of the story because of everything Planned Parenthood does. Yeah. And I don't know about the internal politics of what happened and if it was that she was trying to erase abortion and only focus on that as opposed to tie it all together. But it's nuanced and it's hard. Sure.
And just, this is, I guess, specific to them. Should people be fearful, folks who are part of the pro-choice movement, of the administration's recent Title X gag rule? And yeah, what should the reaction be to that? And, you know, does there need to be more energy behind the movement? Should people be alarmed?
Yes. I think that's a leading question. I mean, people should be horrified. I mean, absolutely horrified, because, I mean, what we're talking about now is birth control. This is a holy grail that was supposed to be totally settled. And when Griswold happened, which legalized abortion, to Connie's earlier point, when medical abortion is available on college campuses, it'll be the new normal. When I found out that my mother wasn't allowed to use birth control until Griswold, I was like, what? Birth control used to be the place where Democrats and Republicans agreed. The Title X program was a place that everybody agreed that if you wanted to prevent unintended pregnancy, you provided women, low-income women, with access to birth control. And now it is under assault, because I think what has happened, once Kavanaugh got on the Supreme Court and they saw their pathway to victory, they stopped lying to themselves and to everybody else, and their true colors are coming out. And this has nothing to do really with abortion, and it has nothing to do with birth control, because if you care about abortion and you don't like it, then you invest in birth control to prevent unintended pregnancy. But again, accidents and mistakes happen. This is clearly their play about punishing and criminalizing women, and they are coming out and talking about it now. When in Tennessee, they just had a hearing about another total abortion ban, no exceptions for life, rape, or life, yes, but not incest or rape. And they were talking about how women should go to jail. So I think the blinders are now off on their movement, and they are showing their true colors. They are not pretty, and the Title X was one of the most creative and brilliant, in all the wrong ways, like evilly brilliant, ways to get at Planned Parenthood, because they knew, well, they didn't know, they experienced, they kept going after it in Congress and the Senate, which they controlled for 2 years or more. They could never defund Planned Parenthood, because the elected officials always knew that Planned Parenthood and access to abortion care is too popular, that people are 7 in 10 Americans support this right, and they don't want people messing with their ability to access care. They had to go and do it as a sneak runaround to basically figure out how to deny this funding. And the people who are going to get hurt are the most vulnerable amongst us. Low-income women, women of color, minors who are no longer going to be able to get access to birth control. And I believe Planned Parenthood provides 40% of all Title X dollars in America.
And so I agree with everything Amy said. If you look at how some of this, so this has been happening at the state level too, right? So Title X is federal and is a restriction that is going after Planned Parenthood and insisting once again on heightened and special kind of rules that would not apply and indeed would violate medical ethics, malpractice laws in any other context. So this is how they're trying to do it, to make it so impossible for Planned Parenthood to continue to do what it does. This mirrors what's going on at the states too. So we've had a lot of states try to defund Planned Parenthood. And the language used by both federal legislators and regulators and at the state level to go after Planned Parenthood is so personal. It is so clear they want to punish Planned Parenthood as well for its advocacy and constantly challenging and pushing back and trying to make sure that we have reproductive rights and access. And so one might think, are you allowed to do that in the law? Are you allowed to simply target somebody like that out of existence? Again, the courts have said different things about this. Unfortunately, there are some courts that are willing to just kind of defer to justifications asserted in court without really paying attention to what's actually going on outside and statements that legislators made. Some courts do. They look and they see, oh, this legislator clearly threatened and said they were just trying to get rid of Planned Parenthood. You can't do that. Or Loyola Law, the only person or the only entity that would have been affected by this defunding law was Planned Parenthood. You can't do that. You're punishing Planned Parenthood for advocacy around abortion. You can't do that. It's an unconstitutional kind of punishment. But not all courts are willing to do that. And so even something that you might think would be kind of obvious and settled as a legal matter isn't.
You both just talked about kind of the heightened efforts that are happening, and you mentioned that opponents are showing their true colors now. Do you think at any point there will be a consequence for pushing for things like bans with no exceptions for rape or incest? And, Steve King very recently made a comment that we wouldn't have the population we have if not for babies that come out of incest or rape, and thinking about these six-week abortion bans before a lot of women know that they are pregnant. Do you think that there might be a consequence at some point where voters and just the general public think that things have gone too far and say, okay, we can't go that far with you?
I think we're there.
Okay.
I think that voters in 2018 demonstrated that one of the driving issues for them was reproductive rights and abortion. And working in this movement for so long, people used to say choice issues or reproductive rights issues, and now, to Connie's point, they're talking about abortion. That is a driving force. It's what drove 40% of the people to the very first Women's March, was the issue of abortion. And my fear at the time was that they were going to let up. They're going to get angry in the flash, and then they're going to go home, or they're going to get tired, or they're going to get burnt out. And in 2018, not only did they show up in droves to vote, they ran. I mean, we have, for the first time in our country, a pro-choice House of Representatives. We have had a Democratic majority before, but it wasn't pro-choice. We do now. And I think that we're going to see in 2020, at least I cross my fingers every day, that the same people show up and they vote in droves. And I think that the other side has just gone too far. Because when we look at the 7 and 10 polling, I mean, we're not polling in LA and San Francisco. We're polling in the suburbs of Atlanta and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Michigan, or not the state of Michigan, but in Detroit. And the people that are being turned off by this are women, and they're independent women, they're Republican women, they're Democratic women, because we know what's at stake. We know the stories of our grandmothers who lived through when abortion wasn't legal. And I think it has been incredibly motivational. And I will say this, now that they have gone after birth control, I think millennials and the next generation are also motivated in a way that they had not been before. I'd done research about 10 years ago on millennials, and they would say, if Roe was ever in danger, yeah, that's important to me, but it's not, so I'm not going to be. And I was like, they said, if it gets overturned, I'll go protest. I'm like, how about the day before, Well, now they are. I mean, it has happened. They are voting. The oldest millennial is turning 40. They're having families. They're buying houses. They understand what is at stake with this in a way that they did when they were younger, and now they do even more so. So I think that this is going to be as I said, an inflection election. This is when we turn the tide, and I think that's why you're seeing the desperation on the other side, going so extreme, because this is their last chance, their Hail Mary, and they've got the Supreme Court that they want, and they're banking everything on it.
Yeah, I would say I agree completely. The prominence of the religious fight in this, so the use of religious liberty as a way to restrict reproductive rights. It was very prominent in birth control with the Hobby Lobby case, and people are connecting that up with movements to restrict abortion and go after them, movements to restrict the rights in healthcare of LGBT individuals. The connections are kind of all there now. Abortion isn't off to the side by itself anymore. So that's, I think, the religious piece of this is actually one piece. And then I think the rape incest that you brought up, that's huge actually, because again, there had always been, for many people, a visceral discomfort with the idea of abortion as just kind of thinking about having to wrestle with that and deal with that. People are even more uncomfortable with the idea of a woman, and possibly even a girl, being forced to bear the child of the rapist or person who committed incest. On top of that, with the explosion of the Me Too movement, so that we understand that is not rare. You know, rape and assault is happening all the time. People just haven't been talking about it. It's all out there now. It's all connected up in a way that you can't not think about this issue without thinking about women's rights and women's ability to control their body in all sorts of ways.
So I just have one last question, and then we'll start to take audience questions. If people want to get involved and be supportive, what types of things can they do? And if you have any specific advice for the men in the audience about how they can be supportive to the movement.
Yeah, so I think on your way out, there's a whole piece of paper that talks about things that you can do. So I'm just going to list one or two, and I'll be specific about men in one of them. So one is support Senator Leyva's SB 24. How you contact your representative is on that paper, and also contact Lorena Gonzalez, who is the appropriations chair. Everything is in her power right now, and she needs to be hearing from people from around the state. Normally, I'd say only call your member, but she needs to hear from everybody about how important it is that we increase access on college campuses. So there's one. Two, I would say join NARAL. I'm going to go three. Join NARAL. When you join us, you're going to get all the information that you need about what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, because things are happening rapid fire sometimes. And you can also stay up to date on what is happening in the country and in your state. So third, men. Wow, we did not win this movement with women alone. Men and women were working together to overturn the anti-abortion laws. And we need to make this not a woman's issue, because it is not. It is an economic issue, it is a family issue, and we need men to stand up in solidarity with us. So things you can do is take a picture and tell people on your social media where you were today. Talk to other men about where you were and what you learned and why it's important to you. Because the number one conveyor, the number one messenger that people listen to are their friends. And if men are talking to men about this issue, it's going to make an impact. So go on social media and support us. And when you join NARAL, like our stuff, because it will reach your network even more.
So I'll echo those. I want to talk a little bit more about the conversations that you have with people, because we were talking about this backstage. So it's not just about going out to tell people what you've learned and you think now and what they should do, right? It's so important to have conversations with people about what's going on and to listen to them in these conversations, to understand if they have discomfort, if they don't think this is important, kind of try to understand why, or if they think the pro-life approach is the one that best suits them, try to understand what they mean by pro-life and what is it about that approach, what would they like to see, because it will likely come out, at least it has with a lot of us, that many of the underlying values that people have are not really being reflected in how they talk about things, because quite frankly, the underlying values are not really well reflected in how the media is talking about this, and how most of our politicians that are getting most of the kind of airtime are talking about this, who want to make it a war. I mean, it's hard to have those conversations, but it's important. A lot of us, have people in our family who we're coming from different areas. We're in LA, right? So most of us I'm from Chicago. I have family in Peoria. I go back there. They don't all agree with me about most of the things I think about. So that helps really change minds, right? Vote, of course, vote in every kind of election, local, state, federal. It all matters. When the federal government's acting crazy, your state and local government is the thing that can really be the resource. But we need the federal too, so you've really got to pay attention to all of those layers.
Well, that wraps up my questions, and I think we'll have a few audience questions. But if we could give our panelists another round of applause. Just grab them. Thank you. Pretty straightforward question. Why do you think men want to control women's bodies, and how do we solve this conundrum?
How much time do we have? I don't think that it is solely men. I wouldn't frame it as a gender issue. I would frame it as a freedom issue and a control issue of women's bodies. And I think there are some women who are a part of that movement as well. So I don't think it's gender specific to start with. And I think it is because times are scary, and they have been, because there's been enormous change. If you look at what has happened economically in our country since birth control, women started going to college. And now there are more women in college and graduate schools than there are men. And that creates anxiety and resentment. Women are now moving in, or have been moving into business in huge ways, and academia, and every single sector. And there's a perception that jobs are being taken. I mean, who else talks like this, right? And so I think it is this loss of control that people are feeling, that the way that they were brought up or the way that they thought things should be is no longer the way that it is. And feminism is a really powerful and potent movement in our country, and it gives given rise to this male rights movement, which I don't even begin to understand. Like, what rights have you not had for hundreds of years? But it's real and it's palpable, and it's driven by fear and hate. And I think that we have seen, when you think about these shootings, one of the things everybody had in common is domestic violence against women. And so I think that there's a lot more to do in our country around understanding people and being kind to one another, literally. And demystifying things is we need to have leaders, both in government and business and elsewhere, who lift everybody up and talk about how it's not a zero-sum game. If you get a job, I lose a job. It's about, let's lift everybody up so everybody can participate and have dignity and respect in what we're going to do, so nobody feels the need to try and push other people down.
Yeah, whenever you try to create a box that somebody is supposed to fit in, it has implications beyond just the person you've put in that box, or what often happens is that box, or the definition of that box, is related to the definition of another box, right? So the idea of a gender role for women is linked to a gender role for men, right? And so that was what has been taught for a long time. That has roots in a few different places. Religion is one of the places where it continues to be taught and affirmed. But we see it in other sorts of cultures as well, our cultural forces. And so it's hard. Both women and men can get comfortable with that, right? So we do see women who feel threatened by that perceived devaluing of that role that she has accepted, right? Especially if that role, involved motherhood and the importance of that. And men have gotten confined as well. And so one of the things that we're seeing is an attempt to try to understand how kind of we've long thought about kind of issues of masculinity, how that's impacted women in detrimental ways, right? To the extent it leads to particular kind of aggression that's uncontrolled, right? Or means women get excluded from certain kinds of things because they do not, project that same characteristic. But psychology organizations are also now looking more closely at how certain kinds of masculinity or ideas of masculinity have trapped men in certain ways and caused them to suppress their own particular desires or characteristics if it didn't line up with what they were taught, right? And that creates a fear. So this really is something that is impacting all of us in ways that it really, not only is it not zero sum, but we need to look at this and explore this and try to worry about controlling ourselves in these ways less than we have before.
Both of you may have responses to this question, but it's more of a legal one, so we can start with Bree on answering it. Do you think Roe v. Wade was argued under the correct pretense? And if there should have been another argument, maybe that was more about autonomy over one's body?
So it's interesting. So I just taught a reproductive justice seminar. So I got to go back through all these opinions again. And something happens every time you reread one of these opinions, especially given the context today, right? And you see different things. And the reality is that a lot of these opinions have been messy, and different justices have actually talked about different bases for this right. So the one that seemed to be the dominant theme that has kind of garnered the most justices is this idea of a privacy right? Again, this is the sphere of privacy that people have where they can make decisions about their family and procreation, and then for women, that also means the ability to use contraception and decide on an abortion, whether to choose an abortion. But there had been language as well used to tap into liberty issues, right? And the liberty that is so important for a woman to be able to decide what happens to her body, very much like we think with other kinds of medical procedures, your refusal to of certain interventions, your ability to decide what you do with your body as part of the bodily integrity that is necessary for true liberty, right, in the society. And we've even had a couple justices try to highlight the gender equity piece of this. And so there is language that talks about, or at least acknowledges that in the ability to control your body is relevant to a woman's ability to achieve true equity, even though the court stopped short of saying, and this is actually legally speaking an equality issue, which means that anything touching abortion should be looked at as an equal protection or sex discrimination claim and scrutinized very closely. And you can only do it if you've got a really good, compelling reason. So it was in there. Unfortunately, again, the gender equity piece got erased. Quite frankly, the healthcare piece of abortion has gotten erased. And it's become this thing that has been much more about fetal life. And balancing that. And so I do think that dominant, what has become the dominant legal theory for thinking about it, does not go far enough.
What she said.
We'll just add in one last question, and then we can wrap up. So Senator Leyva mentioned that abortion is nuanced, and Bree, you even mentioned that a lot of the states who don't provide support for pregnant people are the same states that want to be very restrictive around abortion. As we talk about access to abortion, do you think it's necessary, or if it is happening, a good job is being done on pairing that with support for children and for pregnant people as we make this holistic argument, or should we just focus on this kind of one part of the conversation?
I think it's really important that when we were talking about, you have to look at the whole woman, that this is about our lives. You have to bring in everything, because we don't just exist in one silo. And especially when you're parenting. I have 3 kids, and it's hard work. And I think that, if they weren't wanted, it would be really hard. It would be so much harder than it already is. And I think that we are starting to move into the just total hypocrisy of the anti-choice movement, where they say they're all about being pro-life and they care about the unborn child, except once that child is born, where maternal mortality rates are too high in our country, especially for African American women, where there is no support for health care or for child care or for food stamps or housing. And so when we say that we want to bring children into this world, and women and pregnant people are making decisions about, can I do this well? Can I do right by this new life? And if the answer is no, then they're making an incredibly mature parenting decision that we should honor and respect. And I think that the hypocrisy that we are seeing from the anti-choice community is part of the reason that they've gone too far and people are moving away from them. And I'll give you one anecdote. And it has to do with what's happening on the border. I was talking with some women in Texas who have been anti-choice their whole lives. It is the one issue they vote on. They only vote for the anti-abortion candidate, so they're always voting Republican in Texas. And then they had this moment where they realized that they were Christians and they were compassionate Christians, and what was happening on the border was completely out of step with what they believed in. And you had Ted Cruz there having no problem with what was going on our borders, supporting President Trump's caging and separating of children and families. And then you have this candidate, Beto O'Rourke, who is pro-choice, who was also railing against that. And they found it in themselves, and they created a community that went to support Beto O'Rourke because they decided not to vote on the issue of abortion anymore, but on their Christian values. Yeah. Those are Christian values I completely agree with. And so I think that there are voters and there are people, we live full lives and we want to care, we want to do things right. When you make one-size-fits-all laws like abortion bans, and you take away, literally there are states, Missouri, who took money out of their food stamp program and put it into supporting fake women's health centers, also known as crisis pregnancy centers, which are these places that basically lie to women to get them to stop accessing abortion care. So they're trying to have people have more babies, but they're not giving them food stamps. They're literally taking that money away. So their hypocrisy is just so rampant. And I think that voters and people are getting tired of it. They're starting to see it.
I would, one of the places where I actually see people who identify as pro-life being taken to task the most for the hypocrisy is within religious communities. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things, again, that it makes me sad about what I see in the media, because the media likes to sensationalize and simplify and projects kind of enemies, and you have certain politicians who really love to feed into that. But in real life, we are nuanced and things are complex, and we may have certain values about one thing, but we want to be compassionate about how we live those out and treat people. And so, I've seen within, for example, because of reproductive health stuff, I've been looking a lot at the religious liberty issues and seeing how that conversation goes. And one of the Catholic magazines, is one of the more progressive Catholic magazines, they're really on this thing about, well, so prove you're pro-life, right? What does it mean to be pro-life? And they are talking about it from immigration and how we're treating people who are coming into this country, how we're treating parents and families on the border. Environmental law, they're bringing it, definitely kind of social economic justice. So I feel like that's a powerful place, both to find compromise through some of the more challenging issues, but also I would love to see, on the webpage that shows kind of states hostile to abortion, something that says, and they justify this as pro-life, and yet they're hostile to boom, 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 right? All these other things. Like, I think that is the story. I mean, people need to understand that that's what's happening.
Thank you for being up here and answering my questions and the audience's questions. And also just wanted to let you know that Senator Leyva had to leave. She had food poisoning and wasn't feeling well. But she appreciated being up here today. And someone also had a question about Planned Parenthood and losing their Title X funding. And I know that what they're asking right now is for people to call their senators and get the Senate to pass a bill that's already gone through the House that would defund the rules. So yeah, I think that's what they're asking for right now. But if we could give our panelists one more round of applause. Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
E ter tempo pra sonhar, da janela ver seu corcovado, o Redentor, que lindo. Quero a vida sempre assim, com você perto de mim, até o apagar da velha chama. E eu que era triste, descrente desse mundo, ao encontrar você eu conheci o que é felicidade, meu amor.
Mm-hmm.